It's Sunday morning in Mississippi, and the church parking lot is half empty. The organ plays to rows where grandmothers sit beside empty seats that once held their grandsons. The average age in this sanctuary is 62 and climbing. 20 years ago, young men in pressed shirts and ties filled these pews, following traditions their great-great-grandfathers established. Today, 73% of men under 35 in the American South attend church less than twice a year, if at all. Something fundamental is broken. In 1972, a young man named Marcus Webb sat in a Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama. Same as his father, same as his grandfather, who'd helped build the very building with his own hands during the Depression. Marcus is 74 now. His son attended that church until he was 19. His grandson has never been. When I asked Marcus what happened, he stared at his coffee for a long moment before saying, "I don't rightly know. It's like they speak a different language now, and we never learned to translate." The numbers tell a story that church leaders didn't see coming. In 1985, 81% of Southern men aged 18 to 35 attended church at least monthly. By 2000, that number had dropped to 67%. By 2010, it was 52%. Today, it sits at 27%. But raw statistics mask the deeper truth, the cultural earthquake reshaping the Bible Belt from within. Let me take you to a specific moment that captures this shift. It's 2008 and Jake Harrison is 17 years old, sitting in youth group at a Methodist church in rural Tennessee. The youth pastor, trying to connect with the teenagers, brings up evolution. "Now, I know what they're teaching you in school," he says, "but we know the truth." Jake had just spent 3 months in AP biology, learning about DNA evidence, fossil records, carbon dating. He'd seen the evidence with his own eyes through microscopes. The youth pastor presented no counter-evidence, no scientific discussion, just an appeal to faith over fact. Jake never went back. When I interviewed him in 2023, now 32 and working as a data analyst in Nashville, he told me, "That was the moment I realized I had to choose between my mind and my community. I chose my mind." Stories like Jake's repeat across the South with eerie consistency, but they're symptoms of something larger, something that's been building for decades. To understand why young Southern men are abandoning the church, we have to go back to understand what the Southern church was and what it became. The Southern church, particularly the evangelical and Baptist traditions that dominate the region, built itself on 3 foundational pillars: community, moral authority, and cultural identity. For generations, these pillars held firm. The church wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was the social infrastructure of Southern life. Business deals happened after services. Marriages were arranged through church connections. Your reputation in the community was inseparable from your standing in the church. If you wanted to succeed in the South, you went to church. It wasn't really even a choice. But here's what's fascinating. That system worked as long as the South remained relatively isolated, culturally homogeneous, and economically agricultural. The moment those conditions began to change, cracks appeared in the foundation. The first major crack appeared with television, though nobody recognized it at the time. When families in Georgia and South Carolina started watching the same shows as families in New York and California in the 1960s and 70s, the cultural isolation that had preserved Southern church culture began to erode. Young men saw different ways of living, different value systems, different paths to success that didn't require Sunday morning attendance. Then came the internet, and the trickle became a flood. Suddenly, a teenager in rural Arkansas had access to every argument, every philosophy, every perspective that had ever been articulated. The church's traditional response to doubt, just have faith or don't question God's word, stopped working when that same teenager could spend an evening reading Thomas Aquinas, Richard Dawkins, and hundreds of personal testimonies from former believers, all from his bedroom. But information access alone doesn't explain the exodus. Plenty of young people encounter challenging ideas and remain committed to their faith. Something else happened, something more personal and more damaging. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world. If you're finding value in this deep dive, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us continue bringing you these detailed investigations. And I'm curious, where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. The breaking point for many young Southern men wasn't intellectual at all. It was moral. And it centered on a single word: hypocrisy. Let me tell you about Tyler Chen. Tyler grew up in a small Pentecostal church outside of Atlanta in the 1990s. Every Sunday, his pastor preached about loving your neighbor, helping the poor, treating others as you'd want to be treated. Basic Christian doctrine, right from the Sermon on the Mount. Then, Monday through Saturday, Tyler watched these same church members, these pillars of the community, treat service workers like dirt, mock the homeless, and use racial slurs when they thought no one important was listening. The disconnect crystallized one specific Sunday in 2002, when Tyler was 15. The church was raising money for a new sound system, a $40,000 upgrade. That same week, Tyler's teacher mentioned that the local food bank was closing due to lack of funding. They needed $12,000 to stay open for another year. Tyler suggested to his youth pastor that maybe the church could help the food bank instead of buying new speakers. The youth pastor looked uncomfortable and said, "Son, we have to take care of our own house first." Tyler stopped attending at 16. When I spoke to him, now in his late 30s and a social worker in Charlotte, he said something that stuck with me. "I didn't lose my faith in God. I lost my faith in the people who claim to speak for him. And once that trust breaks, it doesn't come back." This pattern, this gap between preached values and lived reality, appears in interview after interview with young men who left the Southern Church. They talk about pastors preaching family values while covering up affairs. Churches campaigning against government welfare while their own members struggled with poverty and received no congregational support. Leaders preaching humility while driving luxury cars and building mansion-like homes. But there's another layer here, one that church leadership seemed blind to even as it drove young men away in droves: the issue of sexuality and gender roles. The Southern Church, particularly evangelical and fundamentalist branches, held firm on traditional gender roles even as the broader culture shifted. Men were expected to be providers, protectors, spiritual leaders of their households. Women were expected to be submissive, focused on home and family. For generations, this framework provided clear guidance, a roadmap for how to build a life. Then, the economy changed. By 2010, women were earning the majority of bachelor's degrees in the South. Young women were increasingly becoming primary breadwinners or equal earners in relationships. The traditional model the church promoted didn't match the reality young men were living. When they asked how to navigate these new dynamics, many churches doubled down on the old teachings rather than adapting. 24-year-old Brandon Mills sat in his Southern Baptist church in 2015, listening to his pastor explain that wives should submit to their husbands in all things. Brandon's girlfriend, now his wife, was finishing medical school. She would soon out-earn him 5-1. He loved her, supported her ambitions, and felt zero desire to dominate her decisions. The church's teaching made him feel like he was somehow failing at being a man. He stopped attending. The church lost both of them. This wasn't just about gender roles, though. It extended to the church's handling of LGBTQ issues, which became a litmus test for younger generations. In 2011, a Pew Research study found that 63% of Americans under 30 supported same-sex marriage. In the South, that number was lower but still substantial at 49%. Meanwhile, the majority of Southern churches maintained firm opposition, often making it a central plank of their teaching. Young men who had gay friends, gay siblings, or gay classmates faced a choice: their faith community or their actual community. David Richardson grew up in a Church of Christ congregation in Oklahoma. Technically not the Deep South, but culturally similar. His best friend since elementary school came out as gay when they were 16. David watched his church, the community he'd known his entire life, turn their backs on someone he knew to be kind, thoughtful, and deeply moral. The pastor preached that homosexuality was an abomination. David looked at his friend and saw only a good person trying to live honestly. "I realized that if the church was wrong about this," David told me, "what else were they wrong about? Once you start pulling that thread, the whole thing unravels." David, now 29 and working in tech in Austin, hasn't attended church in over a decade. The data backs up these personal stories. A 2019 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that among young people who left their childhood religion, 47% cited negative teachings about or treatment of gay and lesbian people as an important factor. In the South, that number climbed to 56% among men under 35. But even this doesn't capture the full picture. Because underneath all of these specific issues, there's a deeper problem that many church leaders still haven't grasped. The Southern Church asked for faith without evidence, obedience without question, and commitment without flexibility. All in an era when young men had been raised to think critically, question authority, and value personal authenticity above institutional loyalty. The education system shares responsibility for this shift, though not in the way you might think. It's not that colleges and universities were hotbeds of atheism actively converting young believers. Instead, they taught analytical thinking, encouraged questioning assumptions, and exposed students to diverse perspectives. When those students then attended churches that discouraged questions and offered simplistic answers to complex problems, the mismatch was jarring. I spoke with Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a sociology professor at the University of Alabama, who has studied religious attendance patterns for 15 years. She explained it this way. We're raising young people to engage critically with information in every area of their lives: politics, health, career choices, relationships. Then we act surprised when they apply that same critical thinking to religion. The churches that are thriving are the ones that welcome questions and engage intellectually. The ones that demand blind faith are emptying out. The economic dimension can't be ignored either. The traditional path the Southern Church promoted, stable job, early marriage, home ownership, kids by 25, became increasingly unattainable for young men. The average age of first marriage in the South has risen from 23 in 1990 to 29 in 2020. Home ownership among men under 35 has dropped from 42% in 1990 to 28% today. Student loan debt averages $32,000. Young men are delaying all the traditional markers of adulthood that churches built their programming around. When 28-year-old men are still living with roommates, working gig economy jobs, and can't imagine affording kids anytime soon, sermons about being the spiritual head of your household ring hollow. The church kept speaking to a life stage these men hadn't reached and increasingly wondered if they ever would. This economic anxiety interacted with another shift: the rise of online communities and alternative meaning-making systems. Young men who might once have turned to church for community, purpose, and moral framework now found those things through gaming communities, fitness culture, political movements, or hobby-based groups. The church's monopoly on meaning dissolved. Jordan Peterson, love him or hate him, filled a vacuum here. His 2018 book, 12 Rules for Life, sold millions of copies, disproportionately to young men. Peterson offered moral instruction, a framework for meaning, and a sense of purpose, all things the church traditionally provided. But he wrapped it in psychological research and philosophical argument rather than scriptural authority. For young men who wanted guidance but couldn't accept "because the Bible says so" as sufficient justification, Peterson and figures like him provided an alternative. The political dimension became impossible to ignore after 2016. The overwhelming support that white evangelical churches gave to Donald Trump, 81% according to exit polls, stunned many young believers who had been taught that character mattered, that Christian leadership meant moral integrity, that faith should transcend politics. Marcus Webb's grandson, the one who never attended church, was actually considering visiting his grandfather's Birmingham congregation in 2016. He was 23, going through a rough patch, looking for community and meaning. Then the election happened. He watched the church his grandfather loved enthusiastically back a candidate whose personal behavior contradicted everything they claimed to stand for. The dissonance was too much. He never visited. When I asked what he thought, he said simply, "They traded their witness for political power. Once you do that, you're not a church anymore. You're just another interest group." This isn't a political statement. It's an observation about consistency. Churches spent decades teaching young people that faith demanded costly obedience to moral standards. Then many of those same churches set aside those standards for political expediency. Whether you supported Trump or not is irrelevant. The message young men received was clear. The rules apply to you, but not to us. The moral authority the church depended on evaporated. Yet here's the twist that makes this story more complex than simple secularization. Most of these young men haven't abandoned faith entirely. Studies show that around 65% of young Southern men who no longer attend church still identify as spiritual or believe in God. They didn't stop believing, they stopped showing up. Andrew Park grew up in a Presbyterian church in Virginia, right at the edge of the cultural South. He left at 20, frustrated by politics, hypocrisy, and intellectual rigidity. But at 27, he started attending a small house church, 15 people meeting in a living room, discussing theology, wrestling with doubt, supporting each other through life challenges. This, he told me, is what I thought church was supposed to be: community, honesty, real relationships. Not a performance on Sunday morning where everyone pretends their life is perfect. Andrew's story points to the other side of this coin. While traditional Southern churches hemorrhage young men, new forms of religious community are emerging, smaller, less structured, more discussion-based, more willing to sit with uncertainty. They look nothing like the churches their grandfathers attended, but they're filling a similar need for connection and meaning. The implications of this shift extend far beyond religion. The Southern Church was never just about worship. It was the primary institution building social capital, connecting people across class lines, teaching civic responsibility, providing social services. As it collapses among younger generations, what replaces it? Some communities are seeing increased social isolation, young men with fewer meaningful relationships and less civic engagement. Others are seeing the rise of secular community organizations, makerspaces, hiking clubs, volunteer groups that fulfill some of the church's traditional social functions without the religious framework. The political implications are equally significant. For over a century, the Southern Church was a conservative force, providing institutional support for traditional values and conservative politics. As young men abandon it, the region's political landscape shifts. The South is slowly trending purple in statewide elections, a change driven partly by declining church attendance among younger voters. But the most profound impact may be on the men themselves. Like it or not, the church provided a framework for understanding masculinity, purpose, and morality. Many young Southern men are now navigating adulthood without that framework, building their own moral and philosophical systems from scratch. Some are thriving, freed from restrictions they found stifling. Others are floundering, lacking the structure and community they need. I keep coming back to a conversation I had with a 78-year-old retired pastor in Kentucky. His church once ran 300 on Sunday mornings. Now they're down to 65, almost all over 55. He showed me photos from the 1970s, the sanctuary packed, young families everywhere. I keep asking myself what we did wrong, he said. And I think maybe we mistook tradition for truth. We confused our culture with our faith. And when the culture changed, we couldn't separate the two. We held onto the wrong things and lost the people we were meant to serve. That might be the most honest assessment I heard in months of research. The Southern Church built itself around a specific cultural moment, a specific economic reality, a specific social structure. When those things changed, adaptation was required. Instead, many churches demanded the culture change back, that young people simply accept teachings and structures that no longer made sense in their lived experience. It was never going to work. There are counterexamples, of course. Some churches are thriving, the ones that welcome questions, adapt their programming to modern realities, focus on service over politics, emphasize community over attendance, and present faith as a journey rather than a destination. But they're the exception, not the rule. The research suggests this trend is accelerating, not slowing. Each generation is less religious than the last. Once a young man stops attending church, he almost never returns. Even the traditional inflection point, having children, no longer brings people back like it once did. 50 years ago, 78% of men returned to church when they became fathers. Today, that number is 31%. What we're witnessing isn't a temporary rebellion or a phase. It's a fundamental restructuring of Southern culture, the end of an era that lasted roughly 200 years. The church won't disappear entirely. There will always be believers, always be congregations. But the church as the dominant cultural force in the South, the institution that shaped everything from politics to business to family structure, that's ending. We're living through the final chapter of that story. The young men I interviewed weren't angry mostly. They were sad. Many had good memories of church, of youth groups and church camps and meaningful relationships. They wished it could have worked, but they couldn't square what they were taught with what they observed, couldn't accept answers that didn't hold up to scrutiny, couldn't remain in communities that contradicted their values. "I don't hate the church," Tyler Chen told me near the end of our conversation. "I'm sad for what it could have been. I'm sad that the institution my grandparents loved couldn't evolve, couldn't adapt, couldn't be honest about its failures. I would have stayed if there was room for doubt, for questions, for my actual life instead of the life they insisted I should be living. But there wasn't, so I left." Multiply Tyler's story by millions, and you understand why church parking lots across the South site half empty on Sunday mornings. The pews that once held young men in pressed shirts now hold only their absences and the questions nobody wanted to answer. This isn't the story church leaders wanted told. It's not the story grandparents expected to live through. But it's the story happening right now, in real time, in every small town and city across the South. The only question remaining is whether the institutions can adapt quickly enough to remain relevant to the next generation, or whether we're simply watching a long, slow sunset on an era that's already past. The future of faith in the South won't look like its past. Of that, at least, we can be certain. What it will become remains an open question, one that those empty seats might eventually answer. But right now, on this Sunday morning, the organ still plays, the grandmothers still pray, and the grandsons are somewhere else building lives their ancestors never imagined, for better or worse. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. If this deep dive resonated with you, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It makes a real difference. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What profession are you in? How does this shift affect your community? Let's keep this conversation going.